Hello and welcome to Summerlin Presbyterian Church. We're always glad to have you join us, whether you're here in Summerlin, California, or you're somewhere around the world watching this. We welcome you. As you can see, once again, we're filming this without a congregation in front of us because of COVID, trying to be extra cautious. But we're glad that we have this technology to bring some spiritual reflections, in this case on the parables of Jesus, and some beautiful music by Kathleen to set us in the right spirit to think through the things of God and think through the things of our own lives and see where they match up. Thank you, Kathleen. Well, we're starting a series, actually started it last week, and it's on the parables of Jesus. I'm sure all of you know that Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables, so we would say stories. If you were from the Buddhist tradition, they would call them koans. They're designed to help people think afresh, to break down some of the crusted barriers of rigid thinking and to help their minds and hearts and souls become more expansive. Now, the context for these stories that I told last week and that I'll share this week, it's the same context. It's in Luke chapter 14. And as usual, Jesus has a huge crowd gathered around him. And by the way, I just want to say that I love all these years I've been in this role to teach about the person of Jesus, because I find that Jesus, in who he was, who he is, what he taught, what he did, is refreshingly encouraging to people from all different walks of life, whether they be an atheist, an agnostic, a devout believer, a person from a different faith tradition. The teachings of Jesus himself are full of life and full of amazing thought. So I hope you'll enjoy these. The background, as I mentioned to this, is there's this large gathering around Jesus. So picture it in your mind. Don't just kind of listen to words. Picture it as if you were a movie producer. Picture Jesus gathered there with people, and then you've got to ask, well, what kind of people were they? And it says this: now, tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. Now this takes a little explanation, because we think of the word sinner and we kind of go, ooh, like this. But in Jesus' day, it was rather a technical term. It meant somebody who's not following the religious rules of that day and that era and that group. It wasn't so much an immoral person as it was somebody, we might say, who didn't do the appropriate religious activities, didn't read their Bible, didn't come to church from our tradition's sake. And they were left outside because they were considered impure. And it usually meant ceremonially impure. It could also mean immoral, but the main context was these are folks that shouldn't darken the door of our synagogue or of our church or of our mosque, whatever tradition you're from, in this case, obviously a synagogue. So picture these people gathered around, sinners, folks that aren't used to being in a religious setting. They're meeting outdoors with Jesus. And then it says this, tax collectors. Now tax collectors, that was really the bottom of the barrel in the day and age, because Israel was occupied by the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire collected taxes, but they used Jewish people to collect the taxes from other Jewish people to give it to the Romans, and they paid the tax collectors quite handsomely and allowed them to take a little off the top from the people they were taking it from. So tax collectors were hated. They were seen as going along with the enemy, so to speak. So when it says tax collectors and sinners were gathered around Jesus, this in normal settings, normal religious settings of his day, would not have been a compliment. And then it says this, but the Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered. This man, meaning Jesus, welcomes sinners and eats with them. So now we've got three groups. We got the outsiders, the sinners and tax collectors, and we got the super insiders. The Pharisees are like the really religious people who go by every letter of the law in the book. And the teachers, it says the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, that they were the theologians of the day. So it's kind of interesting to see that the tax collectors and sinners, it says, were gathered to listen. And the religious folks, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, were muttering already against Jesus. And they were muttering because he was hanging out with the first group. So there's tension in the crowd as Jesus tells these three stories. I told the last one first. I told it last week about the prodigal son, the father who had two sons, and one took the inheritance early, squandered it, went off to a Gentile, non-Jewish community, lost it all in wild living, came back to his father to beg to be taken on as a hired servant, and instead of being begrudgingly taken back, the father runs down the hill, throws his arms around the son, the wayward son, kisses him, puts his ring on his finger, puts a robe over his shoulder, gets him new sandals, kills the fatted calf that they've been waiting for a big celebration barbecue, and starts throwing a party because he said, my son who was lost has been found. He was dead and now he's alive. And then there was the other son who was kind of like the Pharisees, kind of like the religious crowd. So in that very parable, you have the very people who are listening to Jesus. And the good guy turns out kind of bad, and the bad guy turns out kind of good. But the real hero is the father who not only runs down to the son who's been wayward, but goes out to the son who's done it all right. And he wants them all in together. This is the welcoming God of Jesus. If you have a picture of an angry God, this is not the picture Jesus had. The picture Jesus had is a God who runs toward the wayward, who goes out toward the religiously crumpled up, you might say. And he says, come in and be with me. But then he tells two other stories, and before I tell them, I want to raise a question. Why did Jesus tell stories? Why did he tell these parables? In one place it says when he taught the crowds, he didn't teach them except by using stories. And one of the reasons is because these stories are about regular, normal life, but they're told in such a way that it inverts things, it turns things around, it turns them on its head, and it makes people think. The parables call us to look inward. Sometimes they call us to look outward. Sometimes they call us to look upward. Sometimes to look downward. Sometimes to look all around us. But they call us to look. to see again freshly, to see in a new way. And in a sense, they call us to wake up to the reality that it's all around us in our normal lives. So I titled this sermon, Who's Seeking Who? Because we tend to think we are on a search for God. And you hear people say that person's searching for God. And the first story seems to give you that impression. This kid goes way off, squanders all his money, and then he comes back to the God figure, the Father. He's coming back on a long journey. But the next two stories tell it a little differently. They go like this. Jesus told them this parable. Suppose one of you had 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. And then he calls his friends and his neighbors. And together he says, "Rejoice with me, I've found my lost sheep." And then Jesus adds, "I tell you that in the same way, there'll be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who don't need to repent." So he's telling this story about lost sheep. There were shepherds right out there in the crowd. And by the way, shepherds we think of as kind of quaint and all that, but in that day, they were considered dirty and uncouth. In fact, they couldn't go into the temple area if that was their occupation. So you pick an occupation that you tend to look down on. That would have been shepherds. Those would have been some of the people right there with Jesus. And my guess is there was some guy out there, shepherd, let's say shepherd Micah, that Jesus knew, who had just lost a sheep and gone and found it. A lot of the stories of Jesus are probably had their roots in real life experience. And he says, now, Micah's over there. He lost a sheep. He's got 100 sheep, and he's lost one. If he's a good shepherd, won't he leave the 99 who are fine? He's got them grazing. It's not a problem. And go find the lost one? There's some famous artwork, religious artwork, that shows the shepherd reaching down off a cliff like this, and there's a sheep that's fallen off a cliff, and it's caught in a bramble, and he's reaching down with his strong hand to pull it up. I like that image, actually. Now, who's seeking who? You see, the sheep is us. And by the way, it's not a compliment. Sheep were not considered very intelligent. But we're the sheep. The shepherd is clearly Jesus. He says that later in another place. He says, "I am the good shepherd who cares for the sheep." And you don't see anything in the story about the sheep trying to get home. The sheep stupidly wandered away. I've done that. The sheep stupidly got too close to the edge. We're adding to the story a tad here. Fell off, got caught in the bramble, and had no way to get back. But the shepherd knew it, and so the shepherd comes. The shepherd is seeking the sheep. It's God seeking us, not so much us seeking God. In fact, I don't think we can seek God until we sort of hear the dim sound of God's own voice calling us to the divine presence that He gives to us. We respond. God is always the initiator, according to Jesus. So if you're a person who's wondering, what is God like and why is He so hidden? Jesus might say to you, He's all around you. He's not hidden. You're just not seeing that well. The second story Jesus tells is quite similar, and I love this one because the God figure is a woman. And this is true in several of Jesus' parables. I think I mentioned that last week. Well, here's one of them. I'll read it to you. It's from at the same chapter in Luke. It says this. Or, he goes on, suppose a woman has 10 silver coins. Now, let me mention, the 10 silver coins were most likely coins that were worn on fancy occasions around the head, and they were a symbol of their marriage. It'd be like a marriage ring, a diamond ring in my culture. So suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. My wife lost the stone on her wedding ring, and we scoured everything. I mean, it's very emotional for both of us. She loses a coin. Doesn't she light the lamp, turn on the lights, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, then what does she do? She calls her friends together and her neighbors together, and she says, "Rejoice with me. I found my lost coin." And then Jesus adds, "In the same way I tell you, there's more rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." So here we've got another lost thing. First it was a lost sheep. Now it's a lost coin. Then in the order that Jesus told the three stories, it culminates in two lost sons. So obviously the theme here is lostness. We haven't found our way. And in this case, it's an inanimate object. It's a coin. Now, this was probably a very real situation. Who knows? Mary, his own mother, may have seen as a little boy his mother going, "Where are my coins? Everybody get out. We're sweeping the house. We're finding." And then when she found it, she was overjoyed. These are real life situations that Jesus told the stories about, which tells us, number one, if we're to wake up and see God, it might be that we see him in our normal lives. It might be that we sense the divine presence in our regular activities, not necessarily only our religious activities. So she sweeps, she's overjoyed when she finds it, and Jesus says, remember who his audience is, there's more rejoicing in heaven over one lost sinner. Well, there was a whole bunch of sinners there and a whole bunch of really religious people there, and Jesus is making a point that God searches. God is the one seeking us, and God is seeking everybody, not just the folks who seem to do it all correctly. Lostness and find. I was thinking about seeing God in our normal lives. You know, it happens throughout the rest of Scripture. Moses, when he saw the burning bush, you remember the story, what was he doing when he saw that bush? Was he searching for God? No, he's taking care of his sheep. He was a shepherd at that point in his life. He was going about his business. It'd be like if he was a CPA, he was doing someone's taxes, and then he looked up and saw. He's just going about his life, and God sought him. And I believe God is seeking you. In fact, I believe God has been seeking you ever since you were born, and probably before that, in so many different ways. So why do we not see it? Why do we not experience it? Well, one of the reasons is that we're so intent on looking for God that we forget that he's looking for us. We forget to just open our eyes and see. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the sheep and the coin didn't do anything but exist. And then God showed up in the form of the shepherd getting the lost sheep and the woman finding the lost coin. So why is it that we don't see as easily as we all wish we did? I'm going to give you a number of reasons, and I'd like you to just check off the ones that fit for you. One is we have so many thoughts flying through our minds all day long. And these thoughts aren't just thoughts. I don't know if you're like me, but I wake up in the morning, I lie in my bed for a little while, and 1,000 thoughts hit me before I get out of bed. And, you know, they range from deep and profound to inane in a matter of seconds. And some of them capture my attention, and I follow those thoughts. And then they're not just thoughts, they turn into stories and narratives. And usually they have to do with, oh, poor Bart, or something like that, or worry about the future, regret about the past. And our minds can lead us down a path to where we are not even aware of our surroundings. Driving over here to the church, I thought, I'm going to practice this on my way over here. Instead of thinking about this sermon, I'm going to really observe what I'm driving by. And I was driving to a curve, and they had placed a brand new big orange sign with a black arrow to let you know early that it was a sharp bend in the road. And I thought, I've driven this road 1,000 times, I've never noticed it. It's literally right there in front of me. Why did I not notice it before? Because I was thinking about whatever I was thinking about. So thoughts, by the way, I'm not saying thinking is bad. I'm saying that when thinking isn't being used for what it's meant to be, like I have to think to give this sermon. I have to think to drive my car in a good way. I have to think I'm getting a little thirsty, I'll do this. I have to think, how can I cure cancer if I'm a scientist? I have to think, how do I take care of that patient if I'm a doctor? There's a beautiful place for thinking. But letting it run wild with you creates so much distraction that you drive right by the signposts that God puts in your life, that are right there in your own normal life. So thoughts. Feelings. Feeling can just pop up. I'm a very sensitive person, and so I have feelings that run a pretty big range. And all of a sudden, a melancholy feeling will hit me. Now, it's just a feeling. That's all it is, But if I don't want to say indulge it, but if I take that feeling and milk it and kind of ponder it, and then it turns into a feeling story that's oh so sad, and then by the time I do that, about 4 minutes later, I'm depressed. Has anything really changed from the moment I had that feeling to the moment I got depressed? And I'm not talking about clinical depression here. If you got that, you need help. We all need some help once in a while. But I'm just talking about our feelings running away with us. And that happens to me. And when they do that, you drive right by the signposts that God may have placed in your life. Thoughts, feelings. How about outside noise? I don't mean literal noise from outside the building. I mean the noise of our culture, the noise of 24-hour news cycle. I mean, we all know what that one's like. I have an app on my iPhone that tells me how many hours I use it a day. It's appalling. I realize how quickly I turn to get some outside noise into my life. So it's not just that it's bombarding me, it's that I welcome it in way too often. And I drive right by the very things that are placed in my path, in my normal life for God to speak to me. Thoughts, feelings, outside noise. Here's another one. How about opinions? I mean, most of us, if you're, above 40 years old, you got opinions about everything. And when you really think about it, they're really not worth that much. I mean, really, they're just your opinions based on very limited information. A lot of my opinions have proven wrong as time went on. Sometimes they prove right, but there's really not much to be done about them. And we spend so much time thinking about our opinions and trying to get someone with a different opinion to think like us. And all that time, God's trying to speak to us. There's a passage in the Old Testament where one of the prophets hears the voice of God, and he wakes up in the middle of the night. He's a little boy at the time, and he goes to the older prophet, and the older prophet says, just next time you hear that voice, just say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." I think if we were in that situation, we'd have to say, "Speak, Lord," but speak loudly, because there's a lot of other noise going on over here. We're not listening. We're not seeing, because we've been dragged away by needless thought, needless feeling, outside noise, and our own opinions. And two other possibles. We've never intended to listen for God. We've never intended to open our eyes in order to see God. Just as I was coming over here, I was getting in my truck, and my wife was chatting with me as I got in it, and she plucked a little daisy flower from the bush, and it had this beautiful petals, and then some orange and some dark blues in it, and some of the pollen was spilling off of it. She said, "Look at this." I'd walked right past that 100 times. And there it was speaking to me if I would just look at the beauty of what God does, of the diversity of what God does, of the generosity of what God does. In fact, Jesus says in one point, consider the flowers. Not wildfires, flowers. Consider the wildflowers. Why consider them? Because they will teach you something. Now, we have to have eyes to see it. So do we have the intention, do we intend to listen for God in our daily lives, to look for God in our daily lives? And lastly, most of us have adopted no intentional spiritual practices to learn how to see, to learn how to listen. There are many ways to do it. Meditation is one. There are Christian forms of meditation. They're not that different from other forms of meditation, to be honest. They have a very similar purpose. There's the reading of Scripture with the desire to have God speak to your heart, not just to your mind. There's intentional, what Christians call fellowship, where you meet with other people for the intended reason is to grow in your relationship with God. Those are practices. Our notions, our opinions, our thoughts, our feelings, our lack of practices keep us from seeing and hearing God speaking to us. And God, so when Jesus was here, he used stories to break us out of our stupor, to make us think again. So the religious people listening to Jesus that day are going, what, you mean this God of yours welcomes sinners? That was the very thing they were condemning him for already. And the sinners, quote unquote, were thinking, he welcomes people like us? Lost sheep, lost coins, wayward sons or daughters? And they were having their paradigm shaken up as well. The God they thought was angry with them was actually seeking them, wanting them. So parables are meant to wake us up. Parables speak to us about God in our ordinary lives, and parables turn our view of God inside out and upside down. So I'd like you to try something this week. I'd like you to try a new practice. Listening or looking for God in your everyday normal life. To look at it differently. To wake up in the morning and say, God, I want to be open today to hearing you or seeing you in some normal aspect of my life. Something my husband says to me or my wife says to me. Something my child says to me. Something I see along the roadside. And this may take slowing down, because we're usually going at such a fast pace that even if we're trying to see, it's like driving in a car at 90 miles an hour and trying to look at that one little flower. It just doesn't work. They're a blur. So slowing down at some part in your day and looking and opening yourself to the God who is seeking you every day, every minute, through everything. Amen.
A thousand may fall, but you hold me still.
Kathleen. We're going to have a conversation, Kathleen and I. Wish all of you could join us, but maybe someday in the future, about the talk and about the sermon that I just gave, or I prefer to call it a teaching, about these two great parables. So, Kathleen, thanks again. Your music always touches me, even when I'm sitting back there and can't hear it as well as I wish I could. So, any thoughts on the talk or teaching that I just gave, or questions? Or
one thing that I was thinking about, which you didn't actually mention, but I think it was part of maybe the backdrop of what you were talking about, was how we just need to be still sometimes. And like you were saying, if you're driving by at 65, you're not going to see the tiny flower by the side of the road. And I was just reminded of how many times in our life, the right thing to do is to sit still and listen, and how God is going to meet you there. And He, and when you're still and you kind of block out all the distractions, you can hear God's voice. I think it's in several places in the Bible too, be still and know that I am God.
Exactly.
I mean, it's very profound, but in a way, it's like the easiest thing in the world. We don't have to be out there triumphantly doing something. Sometimes we just need to stay still and quiet and listen.
That's beautiful insight. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to get at in that image of the car driving fast. Linda and I have been listening to a little 18-minute, I guess it's not really a meditation, but a reflection by the late Father Thomas Keating. He was the sort of the founder, I'm not sure if that's the right word, of what's called the centering prayer movement. And the centering prayer movement is exactly that, quieting yourself down so that you can open yourself to God. And it was an interesting thing in this little 18, it's, by the way, if you want to look it up, it's you can just go to YouTube under Thomas Keating, Keating, and look up, I think it's called Surrender to Love, I think is the title of it. It's about 18 minutes. And he's just passed away at 95, just a lovely man. And he says at one point, what you were just saying, to be still and to be quiet and to do nothing. And then he says, he kind of looks at the camera and he says, and doing nothing takes a surprising amount of effort, which is such a great way of saying it.
Well, we've kind of just experienced that in quarantine. It was actually a very good disciplinary exercise.
That's
to
true.
Just do nothing.
It's like but isn't it interesting how quickly we all filled the time up?
Yes.
Because we'd get uncomfortable doing nothing.
Yeah.
But like my wife and I, we've had way more time together than we had in other years for that reason. At night, we're just there together. And it is the same with God. And I do think your point is right on, to be still in order to know that God is God. You actually have to be still. And maybe one other anecdote. When I was, many of you know, I've talked about it probably too much, but I did this pilgrimage in Spain called the Camino, and it's a very long pilgrimage. It took 6 weeks. And along the way, I met a man we were talking as we hiked, and he showed me a quote that says, I'll paraphrase it, that the love of God and God Himself wants to meet you along the way, but the speed of God and the speed of love is 3 miles an hour, because that's the average speed of a walking person, 3 miles an hour. And he says, so he said, ironically, you sometimes have to slow down to catch up with God, or slow down to catch up with yourself, actually.
It's true. And I think in the last couple of years, as we've had to sort of look at ourselves differently while we're sitting quietly, and so many things have been opened up, and we've had to examine different parts of ourselves. And I was actually thinking about quarantine as you were talking about that, and thinking, wow, interesting. We come to different parts of ourselves as we go through different phases of life, and God gives us different gifts as along the way. In my age, different from when I was 20. These are different things that I'm listening for, and God is the same, obviously. But it's
But he's the same, but we are not, which I think is your
yes.
point. And so there's mercies that are new every morning for us, if we're there to see them. But if we roll over and grab our cell phone and start looking at the news, which I sometimes do, you miss that time to open your heart and mind, to slow down.
I also really loved how when you mentioned about the parables being normal day experiences, because I think that is true. God is so with us each moment of the day if we allow him, if we ask, show me yourself.
Yeah.
And we see God in the flower, in a gentle gesture, in all things. And it's definitely portrayed in the parables. And I love that you brought it back to what would it be like today.
I was hiking. I have a spiritual director, and we meet maybe every 3 or 4 months. And he drove up from Los Angeles today, and we went for a hike together. And we're hiking along the path. We're coming to the end of our hike. It was a good hike, a fairly warm day. And we passed this family who were hiking slower because their kids were little. And I complimented the children on, hey, you guys look like great hikers. And the response of one of them was, we're not going to survive. It was so heartfelt, but I could tell he was also trying to be funny. And I thought, that's me. That's me. I'm hiking along the trail. My family's right there. We're all safe. And I'm going, I'm not going to survive. And so it was one of those moments where a silly anecdote like that made me realize how ridiculous some of my own complaints are along the path. So that was like a little parable that happened to me just today.
It's true. That's a good parable, Bart.
Well, I do love telling stories, and I had a grandfather who was a Scottish storyteller, and my uncle as well was a great storyteller, and my father was a darn good storyteller. And I've just grown to love telling stories because they bring you in and you get captured by the story, which is what would happen in Jesus' stories. And then there's a twist at the end, and there's a new insight. And I find that people who maybe aren't as open to spiritual ideas, if you give them directly, are very open if you come through story. And I think we do a good service when we share our lives and share our stories. And that's another point. Your life is a parable. My life is a parable. And the more we share from our hearts what's going true in our lives, the more it builds intimacy. It builds connection because you hear the other person's story. Sometimes I'll meet with people and I'll just say, well, tell me your story. Try that sometime. Just next time you go out for coffee with somebody, just say, hey, George, tell me your story. Sue, tell me your story. You'll be amazed at how people will open up, as long as you don't keep interjecting your story while they're telling theirs.
That's an awesome idea.
Yeah,
I love that.
It's fun. Well, thank you for this conversation, and we thank you for joining us in this somewhat odd technological way. But I want to say, may the love of God and the peace of Jesus Christ and the beauty of the Holy Spirit be yours now and forevermore. Amen.
Amen.